Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Turkey changed its electoral law this week despite fierce criticism from the opposition.
The election reform bill allowing political parties to form pre-election alliances and overhauling electoral regulations before the 2019 elections has been passed in the parliament through a majority vote led by the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, and the Nationalist Movement Party, MHP. The 26-article law was passed after a night-long session, followed by a physical fight between the ruling and opposition lawmakers. The package was approved by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Thursday, despite fierce criticism from the opposition over election security. The ruling AKP and the MHP had agreed to let General Assembly work until the whole package was approved, despite strong reactions from the main opposition, Republican People's Party, and the People's Democratic Party, HDP. CHP lawmakers held a press conference at 2:20 a.m. on Tuesday morning and told the reporters that the AKP had announced its decision to work through the package late at night in order to hide the package from the public. This law paves the way for the state to cheat through sticks of the state, to take control of all ballot boxes, CHP lawmaker Levent Gök said during the parliamentary debates. Serious concerns have been voiced over the law allowing the relocation of ballot boxes for security reasons, while constituencies will be able to be merged by authorities. The law also paves the way for private security officers, armed personnel, and municipal officials to enter ballot boxes stations to oversee voting. Another continuous change introduced by the law is that it allows unstamped ballot papers to be regarded valid. Previously, all ballot papers had to be officially stamped to be deemed legitimate, and the Supreme Election Board's unprecedented decision to deem unstamped papers valid on April 2017 constitutional referendum was harshly criticized by the opposition amid alleged voting irregularities. During the debates on the law, CHP Deputy Musa Çam recalled President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's earlier comments on MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli, causing an outrage from the AKP and MHP seats. You should not spit in a face that you will kiss one day, and you should not kiss a face that you have spat on before, he said in his speech.
Tonight we're joined by Murat Somer, who is a professor of political science at Koç University, to talk about the recent changes in Turkey's electoral law. Good evening, Professor Somer. Welcome once again to This Week in Turkey.
Merhaba Aylin. Good evening.
Good evening. So this new election law, the recent changes to Turkey's electoral law raised multiple concerns, not only about pre-election alliances, but also, and most importantly, about election security. And how do you evaluate these recent changes to the electoral law in Turkey?
Unfortunately, very negatively, of course. These are not good news. They are not unexpected for me, unfortunately. But we have seen quite a few examples of steps taken by the ruling party in this direction in the past. They are not unexpected, but still very disappointing. These are changes that unfortunately open the door to the manipulation of elections, that create the possibility of significant electoral manipulation and possibly also widespread vote rigging, and that can compromise the integrity of the elections and the presence of free and fair elections in the country. Unfortunately, these are not the kind of changes that democratic parties that would like to come to power and to remain in power democratically through free and fair elections would really entertain making, because they certainly make the playing field very unfair for the opposition parties. and open the door for electoral manipulation. Just to give a few examples, the one major problem in the last referendum, which was not free and fair, accepting unstamped envelopes as valid votes. So unstamped votes will be accepted as valid according to these changes. So this creates the possibility of significant ballot box stuffing and also vote buying. Another important change is that the ballot box committees, these are committees made up of party representatives as well as volunteers who oversee the election process, and then at the end of the voting day, they open the ballot boxes, they count them, they count the votes, and then find the final tally and document the official results from each ballot box. The head of these committees will be a civil servant, which is quite risky and hard to understand, because this creates the possibility of significant governmental influence on these committees. It will be possible to have mobile boxes for handicapped voters, but there is no provision about how to protect the safety of these boxes. The ballot boxes will be able to be moved from one district to another upon the order of the governors, who are, of course, representatives of the government, which also creates a major problem. Another major problematic change is that the presidential and legislative elections will be held on the same day. We already knew that, but the voters will put the votes for the presidential vote for the president, their vote for the president, and for the party in the parliamentary election in the same envelope. Again, this is very problematic because it opens the door to influence from political parties, and most importantly, the ruling party upon the voters, because they will not be able. They will not be certain of the privacy, necessarily secrecy and privacy of their vote, which opens the door to pressure from political parties. So in general, and each one of these changes are hard to understand why these changes were made by a democratic party, and especially taken together, they raise many questions about the possibility of about the integrity, possible integrity of the elections, and the freeness and fairness of the elections. They create a very unfair advantage for any ruling party. So any democratic party that would like to, that is committed to the democratic rules of the game, would foresee itself being an opposition party in the future, would really not like to have these kind of changes. And the kind of electoral system that we had in Turkey was not perfect, of course, like in any country that there were problems. But in general, until the last referendum and the elections before, one major accomplishment of the Turkish political system was to have mainly free and fair elections. Just, in local level, there were disputes, but in general, Turkish elections were considered internationally as well as domestically as free and fair. So it is not possible to understand why, or in other words, actually, it is not possible to interpret these changes as well-intended changes, because if anything, the system that was working and was free and fair, it could be improved in the direction of increasing electoral security, voter secrecy, voter privacy, and the integrity of the counting process. But these changes actually are in the opposite direction. And finally, consistently with these observations, unfortunately, of course, the way these changes were passed and made were very undemocratic. Any important changes, and these are very important changes, if they will be made in a democratic process, for sure, they need to be made based on consensus and cross-party cooperation and deliberation and consensus, because all the stakeholders, all the parties and their voters are the major stakeholders in this electoral process. They all have a major interest, so they should all have a say in the process. If these changes were really democratic changes, they will be passed through a very collective and participatory and democratic process. But in fact, it was far from that, from being that way. In fact, these changes were passed without any discussion, public discussion with civil society, broad public discussion. They were actually passed within 20 hours. In fact, it has been argued that even this is unconstitutional because according to the Constitution, these kind of changes, after being introduced to the Parliament, they need to be discussed before being actually voted on. They need to be discussed by the, there needs to be a 48-hour period that needs to pass before they can be voted on. But they were actually, without waiting, respecting that period, they were passed within 20 hours on a Monday, and after midnight, to my understanding, and for some reason, actually on Monday, we don't know if this day was deliberately chosen. On Mondays, the Parliament, the TV, there's a TV channel that broadcasts from the Parliament. That TV does not work on Mondays, so they were passed on a Monday. So the citizens could not even follow the voting process and the discussions when these very important and critical changes were passed by the Parliament.
Some analysts conclude that the changes to the law that you just very thoroughly described rule out the possibility of an early election because it effectively eliminates the need for one. Would you agree?
I don't agree with that assessment, actually. I think it is, I don't know if there will be early elections, but it is possible, based on the examples in the recent past. I think it is very possible to have an early elections, even though the president and the ruling party, AK party, have repeatedly argued that the elections will be held on a scheduled date. But we have seen many examples of changing these and changing the party changing its mind. I think it will be really one thing to realize. I think here is this: these changes do not necessarily rule out the possibility of the opposition winning. So this is not; these changes do not allow necessarily extreme vote rigging, and this is quite typical nowadays in the world. In many places, the parties that have authoritarian parties or parties that have authoritarian intentions or tendencies do not necessarily eliminate elections or do not completely rig elections. What we see as a behavioral pattern is that they do prefer to manipulate elections, which means that the ruling party will not necessarily gain 80–90% of the votes. It only needs to win a majority of the votes. And the way things are in the Turkish politics at the moment, the ruling coalition, that is the AK party, the ruling party, plus the Nationalist Action Party, with which it has formed an alliance, they only need, in order to remain in power, and even in order to have a significant majority in the parliament, they only need perhaps several percentage points in a divided society like Turkey, where half of society is really quite opposed, perhaps even the majority opposed to the ruling party. They only need a small portion of the votes, a few percentage points, maybe 5% or a little bit more, if necessary, depending on the upcoming developments, in order to win the elections. That means this is electoral manipulation. It is not necessarily vote rigging. So, which also means, however, that there is the election outcome is not certain. There is in these kind of situations, there is a high degree of certainty as far as the ruling party is concerned, but this is not 100% certainty, which means that the elections are real platforms of some competition and struggle. So for these reasons, I do not agree with the assessment that these changes necessarily eliminate the need for an early elections. Whether the president and the AK party will make such a decision, I don't know if they will make such a decision, will depend on a lot of factors, such as the probability, the polls that they will be receiving, the trends in the voter support for the ruling coalition. Plus, these elections are not just basically competitions, platforms of competition between the ruling party and the opposition, but they have important distributional consequences within the ruling bloc, within the ruling coalition. There are power conflicts and there are power divisions within the government, within the ruling party. There are uncertainties associated with that, which we cannot very well observe from outside. In that sense, elections are as far as decision makers are concerned, elections are held when the decision makers, and in this particular case, of course, most importantly, President Erdogan, will see, in terms of these different considerations, the best time for the election. Right now, as you know, there is also a very major military operation taking place by the Turkish armed forces in Afrin, in the northeastern Syria. So that has very important consequences on the public opinion and the support for the ruling party. So these trends will be followed, and then the decision will be made. One final observation here is that as far as these changes are concerned, we talked about this electoral process and electoral security, of course, but also these changes do create a very unfair advantage for parties that form an alliance. Because as far as the ballot, the voting ballot is concerned, the way the parties that formed an alliance appear on the ballot creates really an advantage for the allied parties, and in this particular case, the AK party, ruling AK party, and the Nationalist Action Party, it formed an alliance with. Of course, the opposition parties can also form an alliance. They are not prohibited from forming alliances, so they can take advantage of these. However, it is of course known both by the government who passed these changes and everybody who observes the which actually forms the majority within the electorate.
There's been a problem with our Skype connection, so we'll continue with our next video and we'll be right back.
As the Afrin operation reaches its second month, the Turkish military has announced in a statement that it has surrounded the city. The statement added that Turkish troops and allied rebels have captured critically important areas. The developments were also confirmed by the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, a UK monitoring group. Meanwhile, hundreds of civilians reportedly fled the city to nearby areas controlled by the Syrian government. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres told the Security Council that the battle for Afrin had resulted in significant civilian displacement, with reports of numerous casualties and damage to infrastructure. The European Parliament also approved a motion stating their concerns about the escalating situation in Afrin. The motion stated that many civilians have been killed during the operation and called on Turkey to withdraw from Afrin. The Turkish officials dismissed both statements. The latest decision is the most visionless decision the European Parliament has taken in recent years, Turkey's Minister for EU Affairs Ömer Çelik told reporters. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also dismissed the motion. "Don't get your hopes up. We will not leave there until the job is done," he said. Meanwhile, President Erdogan's spokesperson İbrahim Kalın announced that Ankara and Washington agreed to form a safe zone around Manbij. In an interview on TRT Haber, Kalın said that the deal was binding and that a change in the U.S. Secretary of State would not change it. However, the U.S. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert did not confirm the agreement. When asked whether U.S. and Turkey had reached a common understanding, Nauert told the reporters, "We're still working to reach an agreement with Turkey at this point, and we're not done talking with them." Turkey's operation, which began on January 20th, is aimed at driving the YPG militia out of the region.
The tension between Uber and taxi drivers escalated this week. Istanbul's taxi drivers have taken Uber to court, accusing the US-based app of endangering their livelihoods.
The escalating competition between taxi drivers and Uber has taken a violent turn. This week there have been reports of violence, knife attacks and shootings against Uber drivers in Istanbul. On March 10th, shots were fired at an Uber vehicle in the Küçükçekmece district of Istanbul. Following the attack, Uber released a statement about the rising number of violent incidents targeting Uber vehicles in Turkey. A group of taxi drivers gathered early on March 12th outside Istanbul's Çağlayan courthouse to protest against Uber ahead of the second hearing of a lawsuit opened against the transport company by the United Taxi Drivers Association. Carrying banners reading "Uber equals global thief" and "We do not want global thief Uber," the taxi drivers claimed that Uber has already been driven out of many European countries. In his statement, the association's head, Eyüp Aksu, threatened the judiciary, politicians, security forces and global power elites, including the Jewish lobby. He said, "In European countries, taxi drivers have burned things down during their protests against Uber. We don't want to conduct such a protest here, but if the parliament doesn't work on this issue and the justice system hands down a different ruling, not in favor of the taxi drivers, our patience will have run out." Burayı baştan alıyorum. But if the parliament doesn't work on this issue and the justice system hands down a different ruling, not in favor of the taxi drivers, our patience will have run out. Aksu also threatened the press. "Do not make biased news. If you continue making biased news, taxi drivers will do whatever is necessary," he said. Aksu was also in denial regarding the recent attacks of Uber drivers staged by taxi drivers. He claimed Uber drivers themselves were orchestrating those attacks. Unlike elsewhere in the world, Uber rides remain more expensive than taxi rides in Istanbul. The competition between the two is based on quality, not price. The recent controversy has prompted ordinary Istanbul citizens to come forward with complaints about taxi drivers cheating, abusing, insulting and assaulting their customers.
Welcome back once again, Mr. Somer. So let's try to take it from where we left off, but perhaps before we do that, you were talking about pre-election alliances. Let's get to the opposition now, and then we'll get back again to the issue of pre-election alliances. So dissidents within the CHP are calling for a boycott of the elections at the moment, arguing that the new law severely jeopardizes election security. What do you think about these boycott calls? Would they work?
No, I don't. I don't agree with that assessment. I understand the reasons for these suggestions, and they are also very understandable because of the fact that, like you said, that these changes severely jeopardize electoral security, and they create a very unfair playing field for the opposition parties, which, of course, then also undermines the integrity of the elections and the legitimacy of the elections. They create very serious questions about the legitimacy of the elections. And as far as the opposition parties are concerned, they create a catch-22 situation where participating in elections that are that are so unfair and that creates so many unfair advantages for the incoming parties may legitimize elections or the opposition parties may feel that it may be futile to attend the elections, participate in the elections, and they may be inadvertently legitimize the elections. However, the boycotting is not really not a good idea. It is. First of all, there are not many examples in the world where boycotting would necessarily works for the opposition parties in these kind of situations. I think only in cases when in an authoritarian regime, in an electoral authoritarian regime that has existed for a long time, that is consolidated, that is really that is present, and where the rules of the game of an authoritarian regime are really consolidated. Under those circumstances, an opposition party in the long run may win, perhaps, the trust of the voters by boycotting elections. However, this situation, and this is also questionable, of course, for those kind of opposition parties, it's always a big question whether they should participate or not, because they should also show to the voters that they do present a real possibility of power change, that they have confidence in themselves, and they can actually, they are really candidates for governing. They have to show this to the voters. But this is for a different kind of scenario. As far as the situation in Turkey is concerned, I think it is much more complicated. I think as far as the way the country is governed at the moment is really not in line with the with the actual rules of the game, rules of the regime. That is really written in the formal documents of the country, but at the same time also as far as what the citizens of the country really believe, the citizens of the country really think are really the legitimate rules of the political regime. In that, I think. I would count also the supporters of the ruling AK party, party members, the politicians, a significant portion of the politicians in the ruling party, as well as the overwhelming majority of the voters and citizens in the country are concerned. Also representatives of the legal and political institutions in the country. I do not think that they are not really committed to democracy that Turkey has lived with since really mid-20th century, and even before that had significant experience with parliamentary democracy, even in the late Ottoman periods. What we have is rather than what we have is really a kind of uncertain period of transition when institutions are paralyzed, and I think a lot of people in civil society as well as in institutions, they are also paralyzed because I think the most people do realize that the way decisions are made and the way the country is governed is not really proper, and is also not in accordance with the constitution and the existing rules and conventions of the political system. However, they don't know what to do. They don't know where is the way out. In other words, where is the solution? In this kind of context, I think the most important task for the opposition parties, and most important, the main opposition party, is to give hope to the people and also to show a way out. So boycotting, even talking about the boycotting, though I understand people who entertain this idea, even talking about it may have really unexpected and inadvertently undermine the people's confidence and hope, which of course is the most unwanted, I think, outcome in this kind of situation. So, as I was explaining earlier, I don't know if it was cut previously or not because of the technical problems, the changes that were passed and the problems in the electoral process that we have right now, they do not amount to 100% vote rigging. As we see in many other cases, similar cases in the world nowadays as well, the parties with authoritarian intentions, which in this case in Turkey also, this is the situation that we have here. I call it authoritarian intentions because I do not think that everybody within the ruling party also necessarily subscribe to these tendencies or to these trends. In these kind of situations, the parties with authoritarian intentions do not rig 100% the elections. They try to manipulate elections. And in the Turkish case, as I said, that the ruling coalition, the alliance that had been formed by the AK party and then the National Action Party, they have an unfair advantage, of course, especially because of this new rules about forming a formal alliance. But they do not rule out the possibility of the opposition winning. They just make a victory for the opposition very difficult. So the opposition has to work really very hard. And it is also important, it is also necessary for the opposition to win over some democratic actors within the ruling coalition to cooperate on the processes and perhaps also on jointly desired democratic laws and principles. Will have to do that, which is very difficult because of the very unlevel playing fields. However, it is not impossible. Therefore, the opposition should not actually consider boycotting, which would really also dissuade a lot of demoralize and dissuade many voters from even voting if they think that really the election outcome is certain. And there is no point in really trying and going to the voting booths. So here the issue, of course, is for the opposition. If you take the opposition parties, as there are things that opposition parties need to do as single political parties on their own. And then there are things that the opposition parties need to do by coming together.
So what should the opposition do, in your opinion, in this scenario? We've talked about what they shouldn't do, which is boycotting, or calls for a boycott of these elections, of these upcoming elections. But what steps should they take, in your opinion, under these circumstances?
There are many things that they need to do. It's a very good question. One thing that I want to stress first, they should really, first of all, reach out to the constituency, to the voters, support base of the ruling party and ruling coalition. They should also reach out to the politicians that form the AK party. Many of them perhaps not silent, however, that they may have concerns that they may really share with the opposition parties as well. That's something important, and I didn't want to forget saying that. But basically creating some kind of a consensus on the on joint goals like democracy and the rule of law. Beyond that, of course, the most important issue is the ability to work together for the opposition parties. Now, I was saying that these the last changes, they create a very unfair advantage for parties that form a formal alliance. And the AK party and the National Action Party has already declared that they formed a formal alliance. So on the ballot box, parties that form a formal alliance have an unfair psychological advantage because of the way their symbols are situated on the ballot box. But of course, this doesn't prohibit the opposition parties who want to form a formal alliance either. Opposition parties can form a formal alliance too, and they can benefit from these advantages. But it is very well known by the governing coalition that passed these changes, as well as by everybody who follows Turkish politics, that within the opposition parties who actually form a majority at the moment, most likely, either half of the electorate or probably even more than half of the electorate, they have certain ideological differences that would make it very difficult for them to form a formal alliance. What the opposition parties, however, can do is they can, rather than a formal alliance, short of forming a formal alliance, they can cooperate, they can form an informal alliance of principles. In other words, they can, rather than entering the elections together in the form of an alliance, they can declare, and they can first of all come together and agree on shared principles and shared goals after the elections. And they can declare that even though they have ideological differences, they have certain important organizational differences, ideological differences, they actually agree on these principles. And especially as far as the parliamentary elections are concerned, after entering the elections, they are ready to cooperate with each other in order to reach, to make these principles a reality, to reach these goals. And these goals are must be about restoring parliamentary democracy, even if it can be a semi-presidential or presidential parliamentary democracy. The details are not important, but restoring the integrity of the electoral process, restoring rule of law, eliminating the emergency law, ending the emergency law. In other words, normalizing politics and restoring the democracy and rule of law. They can declare that. And as far as the presidential election is concerned, they can declare that even though they may enter the presidential election with by nominating different candidates for the president. Each one of them can nominate their own candidate. In the second round of the presidential elections, they will support the candidate that received most votes. And they can also declare that in the second round, they will support the opposition candidate, and they will also be willing to work together, if necessary, a coalition government, in order to pursue policies in accordance with these agreed upon principles. So as far as opposition parties are concerned, there is the Republican People's Party, the main opposition party. Then there is the newly formed Good Party, E-Party, Good Party. And then there is the Felicity Party, which comes from the same national outlook, Muslim nationalist background as the Justice and Development Party in government right now, but which is in terms of voter support a marginal party. And then we have People's Democratic Party, the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party. Now, some of these opposition parties can form a formal alliance. The Good Party has declared that it is ready to form a formal alliance with the Felicity Party and with another nationalist, center-right, I'm sorry, with another Democrat Party, with another center-right party. So I don't know if that formal alliance will take place. It may take place. Perhaps an alliance, formal alliance, can also take place between the Republican People's Party and the Felicity Party. But then there may not be a formal alliance encompassing all the opposition parties, which may also be a good idea in terms of not putting all the eggs in the same basket for the opposition parties. Here, then, the key question becomes whether then these parties, some of them forming formal alliances, can actually also work together and can agree upon an alliance of principles. Now, here, I think they can. I think they have also declared their willingness to do so. But the main issue here, of course, whether the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party will be able to be a part of this kind of an alliance, which is the most difficult challenge for the opposition parties. Because the Good Party comes from a nationalist tradition, even though it has declared its willingness to become a centrist party. And as far as the Republican People's Party is concerned, it also has a significant nationalist element. Now, the game changer here, of course, would be something outside of these parties, something that these parties may not be able to change on their own. But it really depends on the PKK. PKK being really linked with the constituency of the People's Democratic Party. If the PKK if PKK, I don't know if this may happen or if it is realistic to expect this, but the game changer seems to be exactly that. If the PKK can declare, can decide to unilaterally cease violence, cease hostilities, and give up arms of some sort, this will make it much easier for the opposition parties to come together, because in the presence all the politics takes place under the shadow of a war, an armed conflict with the PKK. Which, of course, in any other part of the world, as far as the majority of the voters are concerned, very much fuels the nationalist reflexes. And under these circumstances, of course, it becomes very difficult for the opposition party, any opposition party, to work together with the People's Democratic Party. Because immediately it opens the possibility of heavy attack from the ruling coalition. In fact, I mean, since the June 7, 2015 elections, we don't know exactly the reasons how and why it happened. But this resurgence of violence and the resurgence of the armed conflict between the government and the PKK has completely changed the conditions, has eliminated conditions for an equal relationship between the opposition and the ruling party, and undermined the democratic process in Turkey. So here, as I said, then the realistic possibility for the opposition, which has a real possibility of winning, is to be able to form an alliance of principles, of democratic principles, and the possibility of perhaps making the question of to what extent the People's Democratic Party can be a part of this.
Thank you very much, Professor Somer, for being with us tonight and for your comments.
Thank you, Gelen.
We'll continue with our next video now. Economy Minister Nihat Zeybekci has announced that the government will provide incentives worth 100 billion Turkish liras to boost investment.
Economy Minister Nihat Zeybekci announced last week that by the end of March, the Turkish government will hand out economic incentives of up to 100 billion Turkish liras to a total of 22 investors in 7 or 8 sectors. In a speech delivered at Alternative Bank's Gala Night, Economy Minister Zeybekci said Turkey's biggest necessity in the upcoming period is production. We have to provide employment opportunities to 1.2 million citizens every year, and we have to keep our growth above 6%. We have the world's most competitive investment incentive scheme. Hopefully by March 27th, the incentive documents will be handed out by our president to 21 or 22 investors. From now on, Turkey will create its own global giants in the 7 or 8 sectors that we have specified, Zeybekci added. Some of the firms that are expected to receive the planned incentives operate in energy, petrochemicals, healthcare, telecommunications, agriculture, defense, tourism and transport sectors.
The Constitutional Court ruled once again today that the rights of the arrested journalist Şahin Alpay have been violated.
Turkey's Constitutional Court ruled today for a second time that the rights of the arrested journalist Şahin Alpay have been violated, raising the prospect that he may be released from prison. The decision came upon an application by Alpay's lawyers after a local court had refused to release him despite an earlier Constitutional Court ruling on January 11th that his rights had been violated. The Constitutional Court ruled at the time that Alpay should be released as their rights had been violated. However, local courts refused to release him, arguing that the top court's ruling was not binding. Şahin Alpay was jailed in the aftermath of the 2016 coup attempt and has been in prison for more than a year. Alpay is accused of links to terrorist groups and attempting to overthrow the government.
Safwan Masri from Columbia University gave an interview to Medyascope this week about the founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and Tunisia's first president, Habib Bourguiba.
There are great similarities between the two leaders. Atatürk was the quintessential nation builder of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. There's no question about it. He was a man of great vision, who knew what he wanted for Turkey and who knew what he wanted for Turkey in the long run. Bourguiba was a nation builder for a much smaller state. Mm-hmm. He came a little bit after Atatürk, and I think he learned a lot of lessons from Atatürk. So beyond the fact that they were both, albeit different scales of importance, nation builders, they shared a lot of commonalities between them beyond that. They were both determined modernizers. Mm-hmm. They were both also adopters of a laïcité model, mm-hmm. of bringing religion under the control of the state in order to manage its role in society. They both, within a very quick period after, in the case of Turkey, the formation of the Republic in 1923, and in the case of Tunisia, its independence from the French in 1956, unified the judiciary, annulled Waqf, and stopped its funding, brought religion under the control of the state, and both of them also focused very heavily on education for their publics. Now, there are differences in their approaches. Atatürk basically reset Turkey, and he was managing a transition into a republic of a former empire, right? So it had to do with the sort of scaling back of the boundaries of the nation, and changing course, because for 400 or 500 years, Turkey, or Istanbul, let's say, was through during the period of the Ottoman Empire, was looking east, was looking south, was also looking west, and had expanded, let's not forget, well into Europe, but had taken sort of leadership of the Muslim world, right? Atatürk decided to change the orientation of Turkey to the west and to the north, right? And he changed the alphabets, and he made a very determined decision in terms of where Turkey's place in the world was going to look like and what its orientation was going to be like. Bourguiba didn't have that kind of dynamic to deal with, because he did not change an orientation for Tunisia. Tunisia had always been oriented towards the Mediterranean.
Turkish football team Beşiktaş was eliminated from the Champions League by Bayern Munich on Wednesday.
16th tie of the UEFA Champions League, Bayern Munich put an end to the Turkish champion Beşiktaş's dream season on the Europe stage. The German champions led 5-0 on aggregate after the first leg, and Thiago's early goal in Istanbul extended their advantage. A Gökhan Gönül own goal immediately after halftime doubled Bayern's lead before Wagner Love pulled one back. Sandro Wagner wrapped up a comfortable win for Bayern with a tap-in. In this season's campaign, Beşiktaş became the first Turkish team to win a Champions League group, first Turkish team to win 3 away games in the group stage, and was unbeaten until the Bayern clash.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Desteğiniz will be at Peyote stage tomorrow night with his last album Davul. The title refers to the instrument performed by Erek, a large drum with many names, common from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. Known also as Davuli in Greek, Tapan in Macedonian, the whole in Kurdish, or Tabi in Arabic. Erek plays the drum with his own unusual method, using a large soft mallet alongside various smaller implements to beat and distort the skin of the drum. Tuned lower than normal, taking advantage of being able to walk around studio or installation spaces with the instrument. Erek acquired the drum from a Roma musician, proceeding to play it with private 4 years, where he developed this new textual approach, integrating the instrument into his A Room of Rhythms installation piece at the Istanbul Biennial in 2015. Ali Mahmud Demirel's Aylık will be at Arter from the 16th of March until the 15th of July. Demirel studied nuclear engineering and architecture and is based in Berlin. His practice includes music videos, stage design, live visual performances, and experimental videos. He employs minimal imagery in his experimental video practice to create structural compositions that deal with concepts mostly derived from science and architecture. Aylık, which is Demirel's first solo exhibition in Istanbul, brings together one of his early experimental video works, The House, with the post-apocalyptic Utopias video series he has been working on since 2015. The three works, The Pyre, The Pit, and The Plant, from this series are presented together for the first time in the exhibition at Arter.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.